Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Using the Future webinar. It's really great to see so many have checked in today from so many different countries and cities. I want to thank you for tuning in. My name is Kasper Petersen. I am the head of publications here at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. And presenting for you today, alongside me, are Simon Fuglsang Østergaard and Niklas Larsen, who are both senior advisors and futurists at the Institute, and who have both been instrumental in writing this report we will be discussing today. I quickly want to take the opportunity for a big thank you to our external contributors as well. Loes Damhof of UNESCO and Hanse University, Dr. Adam Gordon of Aarhus University, and Pupul Bisht of the Decolonizing Futures Initiative. Their help and insights have really been invaluable for us in writing and scoping this report. So a few words about us. The Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies was founded way back in 1969 in collaboration with Danish public and private organizations to help qualify decision-making through future studies. And today, the Institute continues this work as a non-profit futures think tank, working to equip and inspire individuals, organizations, decision makers, and the public to act on the future today. And we do this in a number of different ways. One is that we offer advisory services and work strategically with organizations, both public and private, in various sectors and industries. And whether the final product of this work is a report or a set of recommendations or something else, the essence of our advisory work is that we try to help organizations make their strategy future ready using tools from future studies. Now, this kind of work has the name strategic foresight, and we'll get into what exactly that means very soon. We also publish 4 major scenario reports each year. These are available in our shop and to all members of the Institute. And these reports engage with topics of global scope and of broad interest. They all have a clear, well-researched subject area with an exploratory approach to the topic. Now, our latest report, the one which we will be discussing today, is dedicated to using the future. And if you think that title is a little strange, after all, the future is a time and a place and not a tool to be used, we understand, but we hope to give you a sense of how the future is indeed something that can be used to improve decision-making and to make choices that are less clouded by misguided assumptions or by biases, both as private individuals and in our professional lives as part of an organization. Now, the presentation will follow the structure of the report, which is in 2 parts. One focusing on improving organizational decision-making. This part my colleague Simon will cover, and the other part focusing on the democratization of futures thinking that we are seeing today, and why it's important to bring the future to the people, so to speak. My colleague Niklas will cover this section. Obviously, we won't go through all 72 pages of the report. Instead, we've tried to extract some of the highlights for you here today. But before we get into all of this, I think it's worth spending a minute on a clarification of some key terms here today. These are future studies and strategic foresight, which are highlighted here. Now, both of them exist in this big circle we could call futures thinking or futurism. And the two are similar, but also different. Put briefly, you could say that future studies is the study of possible, probable, and preferred futures, as well as the myths and worldviews that underlie these futures. Strategic foresight is when you take those same tools from future studies and you apply them to very specific challenges facing companies, organizations. Put differently, you could say that future studies is more of an academic discipline, whereas strategic foresight is focused on management and strategy. This is how we work at the Institute as well, because we have a very hands-on approach to the theory and methods, which need to be applicable to the challenges facing our clients and members. But without further clarification and without further introduction, I will give the word to Simon to discuss how strategic foresight is a necessity in any good organizational decision-making, what its value is, and what common obstacles we need to overcome for it to be successful.
Also, big thanks from me for tuning in, and thank you, Kasper, for the introduction. I hope that many of you tuned in because you're interested in learning a bit more about strategic foresight and how to use the future to improve decision making in your organization. And I bet that there aren't many organizations where the strategic foresight and the future of, so to speak, haven't, let's say, surfaced in management and strategy meetings in recent times, obviously even more so given the COVID-induced uncertainty that we stand in the middle of right now. But strategic foresight as a concept is actually relatively new in business and public organizations as an organizational activity. And for that reason, many are not familiar with its terminology, and it's not as commonly practiced as you would think, but it's rapidly emerging as an essential tool to sort of conventional strategic thinking. But before we get started, there's an absolute central understanding that we need to have everybody aligned on, and that is, stay with me here, the goal of strategic foresight is not to predict the future, but to discover the perspectives of many different futures and use those perspectives to prepare for a future that we know will be different from today. So in that sense, I am not in the business of predicting the future as a strategic foresight practitioner. The value of strategic foresight, it really lies in exactly using the future to broaden people's views and challenge assumptions to be able to make better and futures-informed decisions. And obviously this is not easy. It requires method and it requires training. Arguably, sort of leveraging strategic foresight to use the future proactively in decision-making is more important than it has ever been, as we're trying to navigate and thrive, not the least, in a world that's characterized by increasing uncertainty, increasing acceleration, in complexity, and even ambiguity to some degree. And add to that the fact that we still find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic that continues to raise critical uncertainties for societies, for businesses, and for individuals across the board. So there's no doubt that the pervasiveness of uncertainty has strengthened the merits overall for strategic foresight, as the world, I would claim, is probably changing faster than your organizations. First things first, let's quickly have a look at some of the fundamental figures and concepts when we talk about future studies and strategic foresight. So what you see right here, it's called the futures cone, and it's a fundamental figure when talking about strategic foresight. And many of you might be familiar with this already. You might have seen it before, because it's actually a figure that's fairly widely used in this field. It's a conceptual tool that we use to sort of depict the idea that there are multiple futures, that the future is not predefined, obviously, and that the further you sort of move away from the present, the bigger the opportunity space sort of becomes. So we talk about probable futures, plausible futures, possible futures, and even preferable futures. And I'm not going, obviously, to go through each one of them, but when we talk about strategic foresight, we mainly turn our focus towards the plausible future. What you see with the dotted line in the figure, sort of the round dotted line in the figure, the plausible futures. That's what we look at normally. And here's another thing that is conceptually very important when talking about strategic foresight in terms of distinguishing between different approaches. So when working with strategic foresight, we're not trying to say what will happen. We're not trying to be predictive or having a predictive approach where we sort of try to forecast and model the future by playing around with different parameters. Because when we're predictive, we're talking about probabilities and likelihood. And obviously this can be very useful if we need to deal with foreseeable challenges and opportunities. We're also not trying to say what should happen or what we want to happen, sort of being normative, having a normative approach with some degree of value judgment. What we're trying to do is we're trying to work with what could happen through an explorative approach. So mind you, the clear distinction between when we talk about forecasts being predictive and talking about foresight being more explorative. There's a huge difference there that is often used interchangeably, forecast and foresight. But what is strategic foresight and how do you use the future? The guy that you see on the picture here is Dr. Adam Gordon, and he's a good friend and a very smart friend, obviously, of the Institute. And more importantly, he's a professor at Aarhus University working with strategic foresight. And he's also contributed to this report. And I think he's pretty dead on when he says that absent foresight, strategy is blind to contextual change, therefore a recipe for failure when change occurs. Absent strategy, foresight is speculation and conjecture disconnected from purpose. So in that sense, you can say that foresight and strategy are sort of two halves that comes together in a happy marriage in order to be able to use the future and sort of convey its importance for present day decision making. But enough of just talking about the importance of strategic foresight. I think you get it now. I think strategic foresight is important, but show us the numbers, show us the value of it. And here you have it right here. There's a lot of research out there that clearly shows the value of strategic foresight. And the findings that you see on your screen right now, they come from a study from Aarhus University with our friend Adam Gordon as one of the authors. It's fairly recent. And this clearly shows that future prepared businesses are significantly more profitable, outperforming the average with 33% better profitability and up to 200% higher growth. So let me just talk a little bit more about the figure here, because the vigilant companies, the companies in the dark blue column, the vigilant companies, they have what is defined in this study as adequate strategic foresight practices for their given business environment. The companies that are vulnerable or the companies that are in danger, they all fall short on strategic foresight on different levels. And the neurotic companies, they basically have too much strategic foresight in relation to what they need for a given business environment. So this study actually also tells you, or tells us, that having too much strategic foresight is very harmful, as it may simply divert too much attention away from the current business. So strategic foresight helps you outperform, but too much strategic foresight can be counterproductive. But of course, we have also produced some insights on our own, specifically on strategic foresight in Danish businesses. So these findings were developed before the pandemic turned everything upside down and inside out back in December 2019. We conducted this survey as part of Berlingskes, and Berlingske is a leading Danish newspaper for you, those of you who are not Danish. But we conducted a survey as part of Berlingskes quarterly CXO panel, which sort of, it includes the 1,000 largest Danish companies, CXOs from these companies. And unsurprisingly, the numbers were not overly impressive from a strategic foresight practitioner's point of view. For instance, if you look at the slide, you'll see that only a quarter of the surveyed companies have defined and allocated resources to strategic foresight as an actual business priority, as an actual area of responsibility. And you also see that less than a third of the companies base their understanding of their future business environment on some degree of strategic foresight. And even more so, only 1 in 10 works systematically with sort of scanning, the horizon for potential future developments beyond a 5-year time horizon. So to me, that's slightly scary stuff, personally as a strategic foresight practitioner. And it also it's a huge paradox, because if you look at the bottom of this page, you'll also see that there's an obvious paradox in the fact that around half of the companies, they actually do believe that their core business will undergo fundamental changes over the course of the coming 3 to 5 years. And that can obviously be due to technological changes, social, political trends, whatever. So not very many Danish companies are working with strategic foresight, but around half of Danish large companies are actually thinking or firmly believing that their core business will undergo fundamental changes. That's a paradox for you. But let's have a look at some of the things that complicates the art of using the future for improved decision making. Some of the things that really what can you say, it flaws, maybe it's the right word, they flaws our reasoning and distort our ability to make decisions. So Pierre Wack, he was one of the pioneers of strategic foresight, and who was actually the first to develop the use of scenario planning in the private sector as a CEO at Shell back in the 70s. He came up with the term reperception, which essentially frames the importance of making people think of the world and of the future in a new and different way. So awakening to the possibility of the future being different from the past and being different from how you would expect the future to be. He also said, and this is something I definitely agree on, he also said that the most important and most difficult task for people working with strategic foresight is to facilitate this transition of helping people think of the future in new ways. So that's reperception for you. But why is it so difficult for us to think of alternatives to the way that things are? From the field of behavioral economics, we have the notion of how cognitive biases flaws human reasoning and the ability to imagine alternative futures. And apparently, I just read the other day that there are more than 180 different cognitive biases. But for today, I've selected 5 of the most important ones that specifically relate to the challenge of using the future for decision making. So if you think that change is bad for business, you might be predisposed to the status quo bias. And this may lead you or your fellow decision makers to ignore the facts because of the alternative not being desirable for you in your current state. If you feel that you have a tendency to always look for ways to interpret information in a way that justifies your existing beliefs, you're likely suffering from the confirmation bias. This can be extremely strong, especially if it's regarding an issue that you as a decision maker are emotionally invested in. The optimism bias, real quick, is when you overestimate the likelihood of a positive income. You have an idea that is so good that it couldn't possibly fail. And then we have the expert problem bias, which is something that we encounter a lot in our work and our engagement with different organizations. It essentially means that the more expert you are, the less likely you are to see a solution when it's not within the framework that you're taught to think, if it's not within the framework where you're an expert. And the problem, obviously, with experts is that they don't know what they don't know, right? And lastly, groupthink is obviously something that you're all familiar with. When there's a lack of diversity in decision making and it leads to inferior decisions and misguided conceptions. So people who look alike think the same way and are more likely, obviously, to reach a consensus based on some uninformed and misguided thinking, so to speak. And there are plenty examples in the history of business on companies that made disastrous decisions, due to a mix of all of these cognitive biases and a lack of reperception. Just think about some of the classical examples like Blockbuster and Kodak and many more. Okay, let's turn our focus back to how to actually marry foresight to strategy. So you've done your foresight, so how do you link it to strategic choices we are about to make? there are a few ways of sort of making this bridge, a few approaches to do this. First, you have what we call the strategy forward approach. That's what you see on sort of the top of your screen here. This is essentially where you have some current strategies and initiatives that you then evaluate against the foresight, against the alternative future scenarios that you have developed. So to simply see if the current strategies and initiatives make sense, if they are robust in the light of these future views. We also call it wind tunneling or stress testing. So you develop some future alternative futures, and then you stress test or wind tunnel your current strategies and initiatives against those futures. Below, you see, you can sort of also do it the other way around, sort of a future back approach, where you you develop adequate strategic responses based on the foresight outcomes, based on the alternative futures that you sort of put forward in your foresight. So you develop alternative futures, and then based on that, you develop new strategies and initiatives that are robust in the future you're working with. Lastly, and this is a little bit more tricky, and it's a fairly new approach that has sort of snuck in from design professions, so to speak, product and service design, and it's called strategic probing. So again, you do your foresight, and then you sort of prototype different solutions and different ideas in the direction that the foresight suggests. And then you sort of see, does it work? Does it stick? What happens? And then you inject the learning back into the foresight process to sort of create a loop and to create experimental proof, so to speak. So that's a way of prototyping based on the future, and then sort of fail fast and keep improving, keep iterating until you have something that makes sense in the future. All right, I've mostly talked about how businesses can use the future to improve decision making. But obviously, as a matter of fact, strategic foresight is also quickly gaining ground when it comes to policy making, as obviously governments and public authorities are adopting a using the future approach to a much, much larger extent than previously. So just to quickly exemplify here, I've brought you 4 inspiring examples to that relates to how governments or public authorities are using the future and how the future sort of takes center stage in policy making. Let's first look towards Wales, where you have Sophie Howe. She is the world's first minister for future generations, and she was appointed last year. So, and in that sense, she sort of represents the unborn citizens of Wales with statutory powers and all that it entitles. So I think it's extremely cool to have a minister for unborn generations, for future generations. Something we could learn from, or other countries could learn from. Then on moving towards the middle here, you have the European Commission, who this year, or last year, of course, we're in January now, released its first ever strategic foresight report that aims at sort of creating a basis to better steer the European Union's strategic choices by identifying emerging challenges, emerging opportunities, and in that sense, sort of using the future to guide the Union's strategic choices. And it's a very, very powerful move in terms of using the future in EU policymaking. Then, of course, you can sort of discuss the layout of the front page. I'm not overly impressed, but I'll leave that to them. I think the initiative is very powerful in terms of getting future center states in EU policymaking. Then we have Finland, who is a country that is known to be sort of at the forefront with future study and have been that for many years. They've also very recently, last year, or was it 2019, they launched the Government Foresight Group, which is a foresight unit directly under the Prime Minister's office, sort of with the purpose of coordinating national foresight activities in relation to policy making. And lastly, we have Singapore, and they've been proactively using the future to inform policy making since 1971. For 50 years, if my head count is correct, they've been using the future to inform policy making. And among many other initiatives, they sort of have a biannual Singapore Foresight Week as one of the flagship events, which also functions sort of to expose the Singapore government to fresh and new perspectives. And in 2019, when they last had their Foresight Week, the overall theme was the future reimagined. So those were 4 very cool, very powerful examples on how the future also takes center stage in informing policymaking. So where does all of this leave us? At the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, we believe that we need to acknowledge uncertainty as a fundamental premise in making strategic decisions. And we believe that using the future through strategic foresight is a very valuable way to do this, to do just that, to improve organizational decision making. So uncertainty should not be seen as a bug. Uncertainty is not a bug, it's a feature actually. And I'm actually going to leave you here, but before I give the word back to Kasper, I just very quickly want to tease with our virtual applied strategic foresight course that we are hosting now. So if you think that what I've just talked about is intriguing and interesting and something you could make use of, feel free to go in and check it out on our website. We're having a sold out course next week, but there are many other courses in the calendar. Go ahead and check it out. Thanks for listening to me, and back to Kasper.
Thank you, Simon, for taking us through the ins and the outs, the value and the challenges of doing strategic foresight work. So before we move on to the next part, I want to lead in with this page here. It's a page from the report, and it's meant to show in a very simplified way how futures thinking, the big circle we talked about in the beginning, has evolved from ancient times and up until our present day through 5 consecutive historical waves of futures thinking. If we go way back in time, the future was sort of a magical place. It was out of reach for most people, and in order to anticipate the future, you needed to be someone like a shaman or a priest or someone with magical gifts who could read signs in nature and the divine to anticipate what was to come. So this is obviously way back. This is the first wave, but we can sort of track this development up through history, all the way up until the 5th wave of the present day, where futures thinking has obviously been professionalized and institutionalized. And the move we are seeing today in the 5th wave is that we are seeing futures thinking sort of moving from something that is exclusive to universities, think tanks, and other established institutions to being broadly used in many different contexts. My colleague Niklas will now take the helm and expand on this concept and talk about how this ongoing democratization of futures thinking is happening today.
Thank you, Kasper. And hi, everyone. Very happy to see that more than 200 from all over the world are tuning in to be with us today. It makes me very excited. And I've been looking much forward to talk to you today about democratizing futures thinking. So as Kasper highlights, humans have always anticipated the futures ahead of them, from ancient times in poetry, arts, philosophy, through fiction, to modern times, more sophisticated and strategic efforts like Simon just presented. Now, this also means that the power to influence our perspectives of which futures that are and are not possible have traditionally been held by a few, be it politicians, professional futurists, fiction creators, or leading technology companies. Now, we have begun to explore how the future can be democratized and then taken out of its primarily organizational setting. And what I'm going to talk about next 15 minutes, more or less, is about how the future can be democratized through new capabilities, through education, and through public engagement. I'm going to start by asking the question to why we need to democratize futures thinking. And the collection of these images here from our collective present stresses that very much, I believe. We are very much navigating an unforeseen and unpredictable political realm. And the promise of AI is promises that AI is going to change everything from how we work and live and receive healthcare. We live in what has been called the age of mass protests as well. There are record high amounts of numbers of people turning to the streets, demanding other futures than the ones that they have been granted. More so, we have global warming and increasing emissions, and obviously there's the corona pandemic. What these images of the present tells us is that a continuation of the past is not feasible, and change is ahead of us, whether we like it or not. And we need to learn how to thrive with these uncertainties, embrace complexity, and ask new questions to find new solutions. Because if we aren't, we will risk to perpetuate problems of the past. So we need to challenge binary thinking and challenge our own assumptions for how tomorrow might look or could look like. So if we are to become more aware of how the future can be used, we need to understand the different ways. And here's 3 overall ways that we are using the future more consciously or less consciously in our everyday lives. It concerns how we think about the future, how we analyze issues, and how we envision the futures ahead of us. How we think about the future relates to time horizons, how we perceive tempo, cycles of time. In the West, time is usually perceived as something that is linear, with the future always being something ahead of us, whereas in other cultures around the world, very much in indigenous cultures or in certain Asian cultures, time is perceived in cycles, or even with the past, present, and the future as something that coexists. So this also speaks to how engaged we are and in what ways we are engaged with the short term and the long term, and that we can perceive change being driven by something, by factors of economics, demographics, and culture, for instance. How we analyze issues at a point in time later than now relates to the choices we make and directions we can take in life. This also acknowledges that we more or less consciously act in certain ways in the present that impact possible alternatives ahead of us. This acknowledges that there are alternatives and that we should appreciate the interconnectedness of the systems around us. The last one here is how we envision futures ahead of us. It concerns the images that we see in our imagination when we think about the future. So while we are in the middle of the pandemic, it appears that we are facing another crisis, actually, a decline in imagination. Essentially, our minds have been colonized by very few and very dominant images of our collective futures. And some of them you see here. These are very dominant in the images that we have when we think ahead. Robots taking over because of automation, growth and capitalism as the only means for progress, Elon Musk colonizing Mars, dystopian sci-fi like Black Mirror, for instance, and a Google search for a CEO confirms lacking diversity, I would say. And even so, if you Google search our future cities, you get nothing but high rises and flying cars. So the point being is that we struggle contrasting these images positively by reimagining how healthcare, welfare, education, work, or governance systems could look 2 or 3 generations from now or longer. A reason is that when we think about the future, we tend to extrapolate the current knowledge that we have, and especially around technology and technological progression. It's much easier for us to grasp somehow, to imagine a high-tech future, but it leads to a dangerously narrow window of imagination where technology tends to be at the center rather than being a tool for us to achieve our aspirations. We need wide-ranging ideas and visions and options and alternatives for all members of society to be able to adapt to the evolving world around us. So we need new capabilities. We need to advance what can be called futures literacy, which is a new capability developed by UNESCO. You may have heard of the recent Futures Literacy Summit, with more than 8,000 participants and numerous world leaders tuning in from all around the world to declare that futures literacy is the capability for the 21st century. Like reading and writing, futures literacy can also be trained and acquired on many different levels. We can actively train our imagination like a muscle, and it can help us challenge our assumptions, our biases that defines our worldviews, and things that guides our actions. As a part of the Global Futures Literacy Network, we work to disseminate and democratize this capability of futures literacy. It's very much closely related to what Simon presented on future studies and foresight, but while these foresight methods tend to have a more deterministic orientation towards organizational risk mitigation or organizational innovation, futures literacy stresses the importance of approaching the future exploratively in more creative and critical ways so that individuals can become more conscious of the diversity of possible futures and their own agency in influencing them. So to sum it up, what is futures literacy? It is a capability approach to futures developed by UNESCO. What is it good for? It can help us to become aware of our assumptions. It can help us to rethink our decisions and prompt new questions. Futures literacy can help us to reimagine the future. That is the core point, but also that it can help us to act from on hope instead of from fear. And I will touch upon that again in a minute. A futures literate person is, as it says here, conscious about using futures to begin with. It's a person that is reflective about the different futures that they use, and they can even so switch between the different types of futures, whether it's the probable futures, the desirable futures, strange or transformative futures. In futures literacy theory, there's 3 defined ways to anticipate the future. They're called anticipatory systems, and it's the 3 ones you see here on the screen. The first one is called to prepare for contingency. This means to ready ourselves for something that might happen. The goal here is not to optimize what we already have, but to be prepared for what might come down. The second one is to plan for optimization, which means developing or improving existing systems or practices. This could be when you gear up your car, or you plan a wedding, or even your company strategy. And then there's the third one, which means being open to emerging novelty. This means engaging with futures that we not necessarily can make sense of today. It includes exploring new systems and new needs that we haven't not imagined yet. All 3 of these systems are equally important, and using them interchangeably is what UNESCO describes as being able to walk on 2 legs. Now, there's a tendency when working with futures and foresight to spend the energy on the first 2 here, plan for contingency and prepare for contingency and plan for optimization. Whereas futures literacy argues that we ought to spend some time on the third here as well. So in the context of our current crisis, Corona, the pandemic, we are already planning for optimization through adjustments to our new lifestyles. We are contingency planning for new waves and mutation of the virus. But while we're doing so, we ought to take a step back and look for emerging phenomena that do not necessarily make sense yet. The point here is that if we do so, we can deconstruct our assumptions about the future. We may become aware of biases or strong-held beliefs that we're taking for granted. And if we're doing that, we might open up to unforeseen possibilities. If we want to train futures literacy, there's many ways of doing so, but a core element in the learning journey that you would have to go through is this 3-step phase here, where we will go from revealing implicit preferences and expectations that we have about the future, where the second phase is about the reframe, where we reframe our assumptions by confronting an imaginary situation or scenario that will provoke us to think differently. And it's doing so we can arrive at the third phase, where we rethink, so we are able to formulate new perspectives and ask new questions about the future. The point here is that it's something that we should continuously train, and when we train it and we become good enough at it, we can improve our ability to imagine without constraints and emancipate the imagination from fear instead of and innovate towards hope instead of fear. So if the strides and tides of democratization is catching up with the field, one question comes to mind, which is this one here. Where are the entry points for the public imagination about the future? One such element of democratization is teaching and learning the next generations for how to engage with futures. There's an increasing amount of pedagogical and academic programs out there, and even literature teaching us how to engage with the future. And it's doing so because we need to familiarize ourselves with uncertainty, increasing complexity, and even to establish familiarity with the long term. I suppose you could say it is symptomatic of how we need new and more open forms of teaching and learning, where we go from framed replication and fact sheets to stretching the imagination instead. Not that the first part is not relevant any longer, but it's very much something we need to see that complements each other. Because when we're asking about how tomorrow might look like, there's technically not a right or wrong. The question is how probable or plausible it is. These new forms of teaching is about using the future as an open and safe space for addressing dilemmas, foster agency, values, and belief systems. One of our contributors to this report is Lo Stamhoff. She's an amazing educator, a close friend, and a mentor for many. She's pioneering futures literacy and is really one of the first ones to implement the training in the educational system. She has contributed to the report with the article and a lot of feedback, but an article specifically asking, can we teach the future like we teach history? Here she draws upon her and her team's experience. They hold a UNESCO chair in futures literacy in higher education, where they're training students in to acquire the capability at Hansa University of Applied Sciences. And I have taken a quote from her article where she's saying, we need to move beyond the existing narratives that are dominant in our memories and imaginations and make space for the stories of others. By discovering, uncovering, and recovering imaginary findings, old and new, students can become the archaeologists of the future. I love that quote. Beyond the educational realm, we can look towards public engagement as well. Participatory futures are gaining momentum in this space. As such, participatory futures projects combine public engagement and futures work. It is supposed to galvanize public imagination, foster agency, and collective action towards aspired public futures. This is where future studies can move beyond corporate settings or organizational settings and become very valuable for the many. While participatory futures has not yet reached mainstream adoption, there are promising signs that this may change. You could say that we're slowly moving from ideology and fiction to social engagements. As an example of such, participatory budgeting is involving citizens in allocating public budgets for public good to bridge the distance from government decisions and ensure representation, basically. Member states of the European Union are currently developing what they call the Conference on the Future of Europe to get citizens involved in a wide-ranging debate on Europe's future in the coming decade and beyond. Another example is a research project called Back from the Future that is aiming to curb citizens' passivity and transform the fear about the future into hope. The project was a 2-year mission set to enable citizens of Munich to create a range of scenarios for living together and then assessing which aspects of the desirable scenarios that they want to apply in their Munich. A final example comes from Japan. It's a movement out of Japan called Futures Design, where citizens are getting involved in futures work and take on the role of future generations, for example, through role play. So the point here is that we need the future to come out in the open, to foster new inspiration, narratives, and ideas, to fuel the democratic debate even. It's an opportunity to decentralize the future for public institutions, and they can transform their audiences into participants and enable new publicly shared images of desired futures by doing so. It's about welcoming the individual to challenge boundaries and identify seeds of change. So if you wish to nurture your inner futurists, futures thinking in general, then you can ask yourself these questions. Why is it important to think about the future for me? What does change look like around myself? What is the attitude I have towards the future? Am I pessimistic? Am I optimistic? To what degree do I feel I have agency? What assumption do I possibly hold that others may not? And where can I go to facilitate and stimulate my own futures thinking in my online or offline communities? On a final remark on why we need to democratize futures, a famous guy once said, "The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking." And on a final note, this was posted by a fellow futurist called John Sweeney on Twitter yesterday, and I could not help myself borrowing it as a takeaway from today's presentation. So when you're from this point, think about how to use the future, but find the terms to be overlapping or used interchangeably. It's understandable, but do try to remember this. Foresight on the right here can be seen as slightly more conservative or an applied approach in organizational setting in relation to decision-making, for instance. Whereas futures, on the other side here, allows for much wider and wilder imaginations without constraints. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Casper.
Thank you, Niklas. And we are nearing the end of the webinar, but to round off, we do want to go through your questions. Remember, the Q&A is still open, so be sure to send us your questions if there's anything you want to ask. But to start off, I found a good question here from Peter Petrov, who asks, regarding strategic probing, how can you test and iterate a strategy given the fact that variables are potentially unlimited? Is it some kind of war games simulation? I guess this question could be for you, Simon.
Yes, and thanks a lot for the question, Peter. Great question. And I think I'm going to take the opportunity to actually answer 3 of the questions that I see in the chat at the same time around the strategic probing. And as some of you actually noted in the questions, strategic probing is very similar to design fiction, sort of the design approach, which has sort of then been converted or adjusted to make a little bit more sense, you would say, and with a little bit more constraint, a little bit more applied in a strategic setting. So absolutely true. Strategic probing relates to design futures or design fiction. And to answer your question, Peter, there obviously per definition are an indefinite amount of future scenarios. And obviously you can't test everything against all futures, right? That wouldn't make sense. But one very powerful way that we use, and as you would also maybe remember from that exact slide with the scenarios, one way, very powerful way that we construct scenarios is to sort of frame the scenarios around, frame the explorative scenarios around some of the key uncertainties, key strategic uncertainties for an organization. So what are some of the key issues that you're uncertain about as an organization? Because if there's something that decision makers don't like, it's navigating under uncertainty. And that's why we sort of bring the uncertainties forward and exploratively create scenarios and do scenario planning based on that. So you're absolutely right when you say that, when you ask, how do you test it against an indefinite number of futures? We don't. We try to frame scenarios around the most important uncertainties. And I hope that sort of answers the question. Niklas, any questions that you like, or else I can go ahead and take another one?
I have one right here from Rebecca Santos. What are the biggest governance challenges when it comes to managing participatory futures projects? Well, the first thing, and that comes to mind, and why I think it's not mainstream, is because it's simply it differs from traditional governance. Obviously, it's often lengthy processes, and it's also it's hard to work with the data. It's difficult to work with the data that you get in, because it's obviously opinions, meanings, thoughts, and experiences from individuals. So you get a very uneven output. So we need to start developing more tools and systems and models for working with such outputs before I think it will actually take off. There's another question here. I believe it was to the participatory projects. There's a question to what title it was and more information. Please send me an email afterwards and I will make sure to send the link to it. But the Back to the Future project was driven by a French think tank called WeShare. And it was about collecting citizens, developing scenarios for how living in future Munich could look like. And then afterwards, on the back of those scenarios, assessing which of them are the most desirable, and then start applying those desirable parts of the scenarios into the Munich culture.
Should I go ahead with a question, Nick?
Please.
There's a great question from Pritam Hiramun on where do you see synergies on how futures thinking and foresight can inform innovation and discover new ideas? And I would actually answer this fairly straightforward and fairly quickly. I see it simply as a prerequisite. There's no innovation without future, and there's no strategy without future. So it's not just about synergies, it's about the future being a prerequisite to be able to generate new ideas and push forward innovation in organizations. So there's a lot of questions coming in now and trying to keep sort of track on what's coming in. Maybe Nick, do you have one?
Yes, I have. I have one here from Rupert Conford. What role do I think that journalism should play in helping to construct futures? There's some talk in the UK about journalism as a solutions tool. I think journalism, writing, and writing in general plays a huge role in fostering images of what the future might look like. I'm gonna mention an example of a collection of articles that I really, really love. It's from the New York Times. They have these op-eds from the future where they write as it was articles from 2030, 2035, and cover critical subjects that are problematic or challenging today. And then they look back from the future towards our present moment on how things have developed or changed or needed to change for us to arrive at certain situations. So in that sense, I do really think that journalism can help foster and democratize images of the future to a very large extent.
Cool, I can go ahead. There's a question from Friederike Riemer. It's a fairly long question, so I'm not going to read it all. But what are your thoughts on games and stories? She used it in her future work with companies and find it helpful to make people overcome old ways of thinking. And that is exactly the point of reperception, as I talked about. And I bet, without knowing Friederike, I bet she works sort of with, sort of a design branch of futures thinking a little bit more, where you actually work with conveying stories and helping people, overcome that sort of thinking. It's very, very powerful. And you're also seeing new ways of leveraging technologies to sort of help people repercept or overcome their entrenched views and argumentations. For example, virtual reality can be used for this, and different ways of presenting alternative futures in a way that's not just a report that might be dull. Yeah. I can also go ahead. There was another question that I wanted to. Sure, there's a question from, and sorry for my pronunciation here, Nele Satrup. How do you prepare the people to imagine futures without understanding the capabilities of emerging technology? I'm thinking specifically about quantum computing, where the consequences and possibilities are very hard to understand or even imagine. And of course, that's a huge challenge, and I'm not exactly sure that is possible. I mean, it's possible to sort of move boundaries and help people think about stuff in different ways, but to have people grasp the vast consequences of new technologies that are definitely coming and out there, that's very, very difficult. But one thing I do want to say, especially when talking about technological trends, it is fairly clear that you often tend to sort of overestimate the impact of new technologies in the short run. But then again, in the longer run, you often tend to underestimate the impact of new technologies. So overestimate in the short run and underestimate in the longer run. I hope that sort of answered the question a little bit.
I have another one here that was on how design thinking and strategic foresight are unifying or fit together. And I think that's a very interesting and also very long discussion, but I'm gonna look at it like this. I do think that future studies and strategic foresight processes are about asking questions. It's about opening up the opportunity space and to carve out potential avenues of change. And then you can couple that to the design process, as I see very much design as something that seeks to answer those questions. So there's a lot of research being made these days and pilot projects on how these two entities are going to fit together. But essentially, future studies ask questions, design answers those questions.
Niklas, that's a great question here for Pernille Brandt that maybe we can answer in unison here. And I hope I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm putting myself a little bit on the spot here. The question is, what should be the one essential question that the European Commission will ask the citizens during the conference for the future of Europe? So one thing for me, at least, would be to ask citizens, how do you see yourself thrive, not just survive, but thrive in the future? That would be an essential question for me. I don't know if you have one, Nick.
There's plenty coming to mind. I also do think that measures of well-being are like, how do we measure well-being and progress outside of GDP growth, for instance? What's the citizen perspective on this? I also think that I can draw on another European study. I can't remember the name, I'm so sorry, but I know there was 3 pilot projects put out there to gain or to try to harvest citizen opinions on what a sustainable future for Europe could look like. And when they synthesized this input, the vast majority were concerned with how people are getting educated and how the European Union as a whole will innovate. So I do think that those 2 aspects, education and innovation, are very relevant in this regard as well.
So there's one more question I would like to answer here, and it is, let me just scroll down to find it. How far realistically do you think current foresight and futures methods allows us to envision? And I bet you're thinking of the futures cone that I showed you. It depends on context. It really depends on context. From a strategic foresight point of view, where we work with, let's say, a business, it really depends on sort of the pace and velocity of change within your business sector, within sort of the what can you say, the chessboard that you're playing on as a business. But in, you know, obviously the further out in the future, that you venture, the wider the outcome space or the opportunity space sort of becomes, and the more sort of speculation or science fiction or whatever you want to call it does it become. So it's always, when I work with, or when we work with a client, any organization, this is something that we sit down and talk through at the very beginning when we scope a project, in order to, you know, have a strategic time horizon in that sense.
And I think maybe on that note, with respect for time, we are coming up at 4 o'clock, which we has set from 3 to 4 for this webinar. What do you say, guys? Do you want to take more questions, or?
Go ahead and put on the next slide, Niklas. And I think then we're slowly checking out.
Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone, for all your questions and your time. I'm sure Niklas and Simon could go on all day, but we do need to wrap it up now. So I'll just drop a few plugs here before you go. You can find the Using the Future report and our various other reports and magazines at cifs.dk/shop. And if you'd like to access future reports, as well as a number of other perks, we encourage you to go check out our personal memberships at cifs.dk/personal-membership. Finally, as Simon mentioned, we are currently running virtual courses on applied strategic foresight in March, April, and May. And you can read more about these courses on the front page of cifs.dk. And finally, for those asking, yes, we will be sharing the webinar recording next week, so stay tuned and be sure to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter for news on this. With that, we want to thank you all for tuning in and have a great weekend. And yeah, we hope to see you next time. We've sort of made this a running tradition now that we launch these new scenario reports online on a virtual webinar. So the next one will be coming up in 3 months' time and will be on the topic of urban futures. So do stay tuned, and we hope to see you again. All right, have a great weekend, guys.